That night, right in the middle of a family dinner, my husband placed his hand on my back and smiled, as if he were about to share good news. Then he said a sentence that made the entire table fall silent. "I invited Naomi to your sister's wedding. If you trust me, you'll understand." Naomi, his ex. The fork in Olivia's hand froze in midair. My mother looked down at her plate, as if she had misheard something. And me? I simply smiled and said gently, "Of course, I trust you." But in that moment, in my mind, I already knew one thing clearly. On the night of that rehearsal dinner, I would not walk into that room alone, because the night before, Naomi's husband already had my phone number. The dining room in my parents' house in Connecticut that evening looked exactly like every other Sunday night. The soft yellow light reflected off the old oak table. My mother had just set down a plate of roasted potatoes, and my father was pouring more wine into his glass. Olivia sat across from me with her wedding planner notebook open in front of her. Everything was so peaceful that if someone had walked in at that moment, they would have thought this was just an ordinary family dinner. Until Grant said the next sentence. He placed his hand on the back of my chair and smiled as if he were sharing a very small piece of good news. "Oh, I forgot to mention," he said casually. "I invited Naomi to Olivia's rehearsal dinner." That name made the air in the room freeze. Olivia stopped her fork in midair. My father slowly set his wineglass down, and my mother, the woman who always maintained perfect manners in every situation, simply tilted her head slightly. "Naomi?" Olivia asked slowly. "Your ex-girlfriend?" Grant laughed softly, the polite kind of laugh he always used when he wanted to make something sound trivial. "Just an old friend," he said. "You know that. Isabella knows. Naomi used to be very close with our family." I didn't say anything. I just wanted to hear him keep talking. Grant pulled out a chair and sat down beside me, completely relaxed, as if he were telling a sweet memory. "Naomi helped Mom with the library fundraiser a few years ago," he said, turning to my mother. "You remember, right?" My mother paused for a very brief second. Other people might not have noticed, but I did. Because my mother had never organized any fundraiser at all. She only occasionally helped sell old books at the town library. But my mother was the kind of woman who would never embarrass anyone in front of the entire dinner table. So she simply smiled gently. "Oh, maybe I do remember," she said. Grant nodded as if the memory had just been confirmed. "She even went to the beach with us once. Cape May that summer. Dad, remember?" My father frowned. "Cape May?" My family had never owned a vacation house there. The dangerous thing about Grant's lies wasn't their size. He said them as if all of us had simply forgotten. Olivia leaned back in her chair, watching Grant carefully. "I don't remember ever meeting her." Grant shrugged. "You were studying in Boston back then." Olivia studied at Columbia, less than an hour from home, but Grant said it lightly and continued the story as if everything were perfectly logical. "Naomi just moved back to New York for work," he said. "When she heard Olivia was getting married, she said she really wanted to see everyone again." I felt his eyes pass over me then, quick but clear. He glanced at me very quickly. That was enough. Grant wasn't just inviting his ex to my sister's rehearsal dinner. He was building a story. My phone vibrated softly under the table. A message from Olivia. What the hell is he doing? I read the message for a few seconds, then replied, "Act normal." After a short pause, I added another line, "Trust me." Olivia looked up at me. I gave her a small nod. Grant seemed satisfied that dinner continued normally. He poured more wine for my father, then said something that made the entire table truly fall silent. "Actually," he said, slowly turning the wineglass in his hand, "I was thinking something else. Naomi should sit at the family table." My mother blinked. The family table? Yeah, Grant said. The table near the stage. Naomi will like hearing the speeches. Olivia looked directly at him. You want to put your ex-girlfriend at the family table during my rehearsal dinner? Grant smiled patiently. Not an ex-girlfriend, an old friend. Then he turned to me. What do you think, Bella? That question wasn't meant to ask for my opinion. It was a test. Grant wanted to see if I would dare ruin the family dinner. He wanted me to choose between the truth and the peace in this room. I set my fork down and looked around the table. My father was watching Grant with a confused expression. My mother still held the polite smile of a perfect host. Olivia looked at me as if waiting for a signal, and Grant looked at me like a man who was certain he had already won. I smiled. Grant has always been very generous with his friends, I said softly. I'm sure Naomi will be very happy. Grant looked at me for another second. There was a flash of satisfaction in his eyes, as if he had just won a chess move. Dinner continued after that. My mother brought apple pie to the table. My father asked Olivia about the guest list. Grant told a few more stories about Naomi, each one smooth and full of details, memories that had never existed. I sat there listening, and I realized the most painful thing was not Naomi. The most painful thing was that Grant truly believed I would help him turn that lie into reality. After dinner, Olivia followed me into the kitchen. What are you doing? She asked quietly. I placed a plate into the sink, the sound of water running clearly in the quiet kitchen. Waiting, I said. Waiting for what? I dried my hands with a kitchen towel and turned to look at her. For him to get a little more confident. In the dining room, Grant was laughing with my father, completely comfortable, like a man who believed everything was unfolding exactly according to his plan. He didn't know that the plan wasn't his. Grant showered fairly quickly. When he came out of the bathroom, his hair was still wet and the familiar scent of his cologne drifted lightly through the air. He kissed my forehead like he did every night and asked if I wanted to watch another episode before bed. I shook my head and said I was a little tired. Grant nodded without asking anything else. Only a few minutes later, he was already sleeping deeply. I lay still beside him for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling. 4 years of marriage had made me familiar with Grant's breathing rhythm. I knew exactly when he was truly asleep. When his breathing became steady and slow, I quietly slipped out of bed and carried my laptop into the living room. The apartment was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioner humming softly inside the walls. Outside the window, New York was still glowing with lights like every other night. This city almost never slept, and that night neither did I. I opened my laptop and typed Naomi Pierce into Instagram. Her page appeared almost immediately. Public account. More than 800 posts. I began scrolling slowly, at first just out of curiosity, but only a few minutes later, the feeling in my chest started to grow heavier. Grant had said Naomi moved to Chicago nearly a year ago. That was the reason he gave when I once asked why he no longer kept in touch with her. But Naomi's most recent photos were all tagged in New York. A brunch in Soho, a yoga class in Tribeca, a gallery opening in Chelsea. Those places weren't just familiar to me. They were also exactly the neighborhoods Grant often said he had to visit to meet clients. I opened the calendar on my phone and started comparing dates. One photo Naomi posted from a rooftop bar in Midtown was taken on the exact night Grant said he had to stay late at the office finishing a report for a difficult client. Another photo showed Naomi holding a glass of champagne in a restaurant in the West Village. Posted on the same night, Grant said he had dinner with partners from Boston. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but the more I looked, those coincidences began to look like a map. The nights Grant said he had meetings, the days he said he had to fly for work, The weekends he said he had to meet clients outside the city, all of them matched the places Naomi appeared. I stopped at a photo taken on the rooftop of a luxury hotel. Naomi stood with her back to the city, her blonde hair moving lightly in the wind, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind her. The photo had been posted last month, the same week Grant said he had to fly to Boston for an urgent meeting with investors. My heart started beating faster, but I kept scrolling. Then I saw the photo that changed everything. It was a wedding photo. Naomi wore a white dress, standing under a flower arch, holding a small bouquet and smiling brightly. Beside her stood a tall man in a black tuxedo. The two of them stood very close together, their hands intertwined like a couple who had just walked out of their wedding ceremony. The caption beneath the photo was very short. 2 years with my forever. I zoomed in on the photo. The man looked familiar. Not the kind of familiar from meeting someone in real life, but the kind you feel when you've seen a face somewhere before, in an article, at a conference, or on a business card left on a table. I opened Google and typed the name tagged under the photo. Ethan Pierce. The search results appeared almost instantly. The website of a major real estate development company in Manhattan. An interview in a business magazine. Several photos from investment conferences. The man in those photos was the same man standing beside Naomi in the wedding picture. And suddenly I remembered. 8 months earlier, Grant had talked about a huge investment opportunity. He said it was a deal that could completely change his career. The person who introduced Grant to that opportunity, according to him, was a well-known investor in Manhattan real estate. That investor's name was Ethan Pierce. I sat up straight in front of the screen. Everything began to fit together in a way that made a cold feeling spread slowly from my neck down my spine. Naomi wasn't just Grant's ex-girlfriend. She was Ethan Pierce's wife, the very man who had opened the door for Grant to enter the biggest deal of his career. I went back to Instagram and scrolled more slowly this time, examining every detail. A dinner in Midtown, a weekend spa trip in the Hamptons, a real estate conference in Boston. I remembered that business trip clearly. Grant had called me from his hotel room early in the morning, saying the investor wanted to meet in person, so he had to fly there urgently. I even remembered the hotel room behind him when he turned the phone to show me. I opened the photo Naomi posted during that Boston trip. Location? Marriott Copley Place, the same hotel Grant stayed in. I stared at the screen for a long time. For the first time that night, everything became clear in a way that was almost cruel. Grant wasn't just sleeping with someone else's wife. He was sleeping with the wife of the very man who was building his career. If this ever came out, Grant wouldn't just lose his marriage. He could lose his job, his reputation, and the entire network he had spent years building. I looked again at the wedding photo of Naomi and Ethan. They looked happy, standing in the afternoon sunlight like thousands of other wedding photos on the internet. Grant had never told me Naomi was married. Not once in our 4 years of marriage. I looked at the clock. Nearly 2 a.m. Grant was sleeping only a few steps away from me, breathing steadily behind the half-closed bedroom door. I didn't scroll anymore. I didn't need more proof. The proof was everywhere. When I finally closed the laptop, the thing that surprised me most was that I didn't cry. The feeling was colder than pain. It felt like a winter morning when your hands are so cold they go numb. I didn't sleep that night, not because I wanted to stay awake, but because when a truth big enough begins to reveal itself, your mind almost refuses to stop. After closing the laptop, I sat quietly for a few minutes in the dark living room, then opened it again. If Grant had lied to me about Naomi, then those lies probably didn't exist only on her Instagram page. Lies like that usually leave traces in very ordinary places, in receipts, in calendars, in expenses you previously never had a reason to check. The first thing I did was open our joint credit card account. During our 4 years of marriage, Grant always handled the larger financial matters, while I only occasionally glanced at the monthly total. That night, for the first time, I read every transaction line like an auditor searching for errors in a ledger. At first, the payments looked perfectly normal. Grocery stores, taxis, a few familiar restaurants. But when I started looking at the dates and locations, small details began forming a different story. There was a payment at a hotel in Boston during the exact week Grant said he had to fly there for a meeting with investors. At first, that wasn't surprising, until I remembered Naomi's photo from the real estate conference at the same hotel. I opened the photo again, then compared it with the credit card calendar. The dates matched perfectly. Grant hadn't just been in Boston at the same time as Naomi. He had been staying at the very hotel where she took that photo. What made me feel cold was how neatly everything aligned, as if the two of them had been doing this for a very long time. I kept scrolling through the expense list. 3 weeks earlier, there was a large payment at a jewelry store in Midtown. The amount was big enough to make me pause for several seconds. I tried to remember if it was a gift Grant had given me, but no memory appeared. My birthday had already passed, and our anniversary was still months away. I opened Naomi's Instagram again and examined her recent photos more closely. In one rooftop party photo, a thin diamond necklace sparkled around her neck. I zoomed in on the picture, stared a little longer than usual, then looked back at the bill on the screen. Jewelry store. 3 weeks earlier. Everything matched in a way that made my stomach tighten. Then I opened the restaurant reservation app Grant often used. He always said clients preferred quiet, private places where they could talk without being disturbed. His reservation history showed quite a few Tuesday evenings. Before, I thought that was simply his work routine. But when I looked more closely, I noticed a repeating detail. The same boutique restaurant in Tribeca, at the same time slot, almost every 2 weeks. I searched the restaurant's address and found something interesting. Above the restaurant was a small boutique hotel, the kind of place where couples often rent rooms by the hour. I didn't need much imagination to understand why Grant always liked to meet clients there. Other details started appearing as I continued checking. Parking receipts from a garage near the St. Regis Hotel, a charge for a weekend spa in the Hamptons that matched the weekend. Grant said he went golfing with partners. Several small payments for a gym in Tribeca I had never heard him mention. I opened the old iPad still sitting on the bookshelf, a device Grant had synced his phone location to months earlier and then forgotten to turn off. The map appeared with small dots marking places he had visited. When I zoomed in on Tribeca, the dots formed a familiar circle. The gym, the restaurant, the boutique hotel, then back to our apartment. A cycle repeating week after week. The most frightening thing wasn't that Grant was having an affair. The most frightening thing was how smooth it all was. Every lie had been constructed just logically enough that no one would question it. A meeting in Boston could explain a hotel charge. A dinner with clients could explain a restaurant payment. A golf trip could hide a weekend in the Hamptons. Each piece, viewed alone, looked perfectly normal. Only when you placed them side by side. Did you see the real picture? I thought I had seen everything I needed to see, until I opened the email folder on Grant's laptop. He didn't lock his computer, because for years we had never had any reason to hide anything from each other. Most of the emails were work-related, contracts, reports, meeting schedules. But in the drafts folder, there was an unsent email. I opened it almost on instinct, and that was when I understood that this story went deeper than I had thought. The email was addressed to Ethan Pierce. Grant wrote very politely, almost humbly. He said he was preparing to launch a new investment fund and sincerely hoped Ethan would consider becoming one of the first investors. He mentioned that Ethan's support in the deal 8 months earlier had opened many doors for him, and he hoped they could continue working together on the upcoming project. The email ended with a very simple sentence. I would truly value your partnership. I read that email twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't reading it wrong. Grant was writing to Ethan, the husband whose hand he might have to shake and smile at in an investment meeting, while he himself was sleeping with that man's wife. That thought made me feel something inside me shift, not the familiar pain of a wife being betrayed. It was something much colder than that. I sat silently in front of the screen for a long time. In my mind, I no longer saw Naomi or the photos on Instagram. Instead, I saw Grant standing in front of Ethan in an elegant conference room, shaking his hand, talking about trust and partnership, while neither of them knew that the other was destroying his life in different ways. That was when I understood something I had never considered before. Grant wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying an entire system of trust around him. My marriage, Ethan's marriage, and the professional relationships that had helped him build his career. All of it was just part of the same performance he thought he could control. I sat there for a long time, staring at the unsent email. What surprised me most was that I no longer felt pain. That pain had turned into something else, heavy and cold, like touching a stone in winter. For the past 4 years, I had always thought Grant was an ambitious but kind man, sometimes a little too confident, but still someone with limits. That night, I realized I had been wrong. The problem wasn't that he had crossed a line. The problem was that for him, it seemed there had never been any line at all. And when that thought finally became clear in my mind, the only feeling left was not pain. It was disgust. The next morning, when Grant left the apartment at 7:45 like he always did, I stood by the window and watched the taxi carrying him turn down the corner. He even turned back and waved at me before the car door closed. The gesture was so familiar, it was almost automatic, like every other morning for the past 4 years. The only difference was that morning, for the first time, I looked at it and no longer felt like it belonged to my life. I went back to the dining table, opened my laptop, and wrote a very short email. Your wife is attending my sister's wedding as my husband's guest. I read it over once, then hit send. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact placed exactly where it belonged. I sent the email at 9:12 a.m. The reply came faster than I expected. Less than 2 hours later, my phone vibrated with a new email. Sender, Ethan Pierce. The message contained only one line. Can we talk? We arranged to meet the next morning at a small cafe in Lower Manhattan, near the financial district. It was the kind of cafe office workers stopped by before work, where people talked quickly, drank coffee quickly, then disappeared into the glass buildings around them. I arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe was already fairly busy, but I chose a small table in the corner where I could see the front door. When Ethan walked in, I recognized him immediately. Not because I had looked at his photos the night before, but because he had a very distinctive walk. Slow, careful, like a man who always thought before stepping into any room. He looked around the cafe once, then his eyes stopped on me. We had never met before, but somehow both of us recognized the other immediately. Isabella? He asked. I nodded. Ethan. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. In his hand was a thick manila envelope, the kind people usually use to carry important documents. He set it on the table before ordering coffee, as if whatever was inside mattered more than any conversation. I think I should be the one to start, I said, opening my phone to show him what I had found. But Ethan shook his head very slightly. No need, he said. He opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of papers arranged very neatly. He pushed it toward me, then said something that nearly left me unable to react in time. I've known for 3 months. I looked at him, not sure I had heard him correctly. 3 months? I asked. Ethan nodded. Almost 4, to be exact. He pulled out the first few sheets from the envelope. They were printed hotel bills, each one marked with a highlighter, one from Miami, one from Boston, another from a boutique hotel in Tribeca. I started getting suspicious when Naomi lied about a work trip, he said. She told me the company was sending her to Miami for an employee reward program. I called her company's HR department just to confirm the flight dates. They told me the company had canceled that program 2 years earlier. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a still image from a hotel lobby camera. The picture was slightly blurry, but clear enough to recognize 2 people stepping out of an elevator together, Grant and Naomi. After that, I hired an investigator, Ethan continued. His voice remained calm, almost cold, like he was presenting a business report rather than telling the story of his own marriage. He followed Naomi for 6 weeks. Hotels, restaurants, taxis, receipts. It's all here. I flipped through several pages. Each one was a piece of the same story. Receipts, photographs, timestamps, locations. Then why haven't you done anything? I asked. Ethan was silent for a second before answering. He looked out through the cafe window, where people were passing by in a constant stream. Because I thought there was more, he said. He pulled another page out of the envelope. It was a copy of an email. I read some messages between Naomi and Grant, Ethan said. Not all of them, but enough to understand the way they talked to each other. And some parts didn't sound like 2 people who were just having an affair. I looked at him. What do you mean? Ethan folded his hands on the table. I think Naomi isn't just sleeping with Grant, he said. I think she's helping him. Helping? Helping him get information. He pulled out another sheet from the envelope. This time it was a printed text thread. One section was highlighted. Naomi wrote that she would keep Ethan talking a little longer at dinner the following week. Grant replied that he needed details about a real estate project Ethan was considering investing in. I read that exchange twice. Ethan continued, his voice still calm, but something in each word had hardened. Naomi used to work in marketing for luxury real estate projects, he said. Grant is trying to bring her into a new project he's building. If she helps him get access to investors in my network, they both benefit. I sat still for a few seconds, trying to reorganize everything I had just heard. This was no longer just an affair. This was an exchange. Power, money, opportunity, and social connections that both of them believed they could exploit. Grant wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying the man sitting across from me, too. The cafe remained noisy as usual. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. People at the next table were still laughing and talking, but our table felt completely separate from the rest of the room. 2 strangers sat across from each other. Both of us knew that our marriages, in one way or another, had ended a long time ago. Ethan closed the envelope and rested his hand on it for a moment, as if weighing something. Then he looked directly at me. So, he said slowly, what do you want? I didn't answer right away. Ethan continued, his voice calm but sharp, like a question he had thought through very carefully. Do you want a quiet divorce? He asked. Or do you want the truth to walk into a room, wearing high heels? Ethan said nothing else after that question. He just sat there, waiting for my answer. The strange thing was that once the truth had finally been placed on the table like that, my mind suddenly became very clear. 3 days earlier, I had still been a wife trying to understand why her husband was lying. But now, I was sitting across from the man my husband had betrayed in a way that was far worse. Between us, there was no drama, no explosive anger, only a very cold mutual understanding. 2 marriages had collapsed long ago, and we had just seen the wreckage at the same time. I don't want an argument, I said after a while. If we just walk in and start shouting, they'll deny everything. Ethan nodded immediately. They'll say we misunderstood. Or say we're jealous, I added, and somehow they'll turn themselves into the victims. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Then we need something else. We need to let them tell their own story first. He looked at me for a moment, then a very faint smile passed across his face. Not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who had just recognized a sound strategy. The rehearsal dinner, he said. I nodded. Exactly. Grant had chosen to invite Naomi there himself. No one forced him to do it. That meant he was building a story in front of my entire family with his own hands. And if we did it right, that story would become the perfect trap. We stayed in the cafe for nearly another hour, not to vent our anger, but to work through every small detail. The most important part was timing. Grant would bring Naomi into the dining room first, just as he had said at Sunday dinner. He would introduce her to everyone and retell the memories he had invented. He would want everyone in the room to believe Naomi was an old friend, a familiar part of our lives. And only after he finishes talking, I said, "Do you walk in?" Ethan frowned. How long? 12 minutes, I answered. Long enough for him to feel comfortable. Long enough for everyone to start believing the story. Ethan thought for a few seconds, then nodded. 12 minutes. We agreed that he would appear like a guest arriving late. No drama, no anger. Just a man walking into a room and changing everything. On the way home, I called Claire. She was the only person besides Ethan who knew the entire story. Claire listened to everything in silence, letting out only the occasional quiet sigh. When I finished, she was silent for a few seconds, then said, "All right. Then we make it perfect." Claire helped me keep everything discreet in the days that followed. She spoke with Olivia's wedding coordinator, checked the seating chart, and made sure no one accidentally changed any detail in the plan. Olivia did not know the entire truth. I only told her there were a few things that needed to be handled and that she should trust me. Olivia looked at me longer than usual, but in the end she just nodded. "I trust you," she said. "You always know what you're doing." Meanwhile, Grant became strange in a different way. That entire week he behaved like the perfect husband. He came home earlier than usual, cooked dinner on Monday night, bought a large bouquet of flowers on Wednesday, and even booked me a massage for Thursday evening. Every act was carried out with perfect gentleness, as if he were trying to remind me how good our marriage was. If I hadn't known the truth, maybe I would have been touched. But when you know what is really happening, those gestures take on a different meaning. Grant wasn't sorry. He was simply softening me up before the rehearsal dinner. He wanted me sitting quietly when Naomi walked into the room. One evening, while he was arranging a fresh bouquet in the vase on the kitchen table, my father called. He asked about the seating chart for the rehearsal dinner, and I could hear a trace of suspicion in his voice. "Grant called me twice today just to talk about the seat for someone named Naomi," he said. "He seems very concerned that she be seated near the stage." I told my father everything was fine, but when I hung up, I knew he had begun to feel that something was wrong. Grant had gone even further than that. Claire told me he had given the wedding coordinator an envelope with $1,000 in it, just to make sure Naomi was seated at the table closest to the family, right beside the spot where people would stand to give speeches. I heard that without feeling surprised. Grant had always believed that if he controlled enough details, everything would unfold according to his plan. The days before the rehearsal dinner passed with a strange rhythm. During the day, I worked, spoke normally with Grant, and even laughed when he told a few small stories. At night, I texted Ethan to confirm each step of the plan. Every detail had to be right. The moment Grant entered the room where Naomi would sit, and the moment Ethan would appear. One evening, Grant brought home a bouquet of pale pink peonies, the kind of flowers I had once told him I loved. He put them in a vase, then turned to me with that familiar smile. "I thought you'd like them," he said. I looked at the bouquet for a moment, then thanked him. Grant seemed very pleased with that response. He thought he was fixing something, or at least keeping everything calm for a few more days. But when he left the kitchen, I remained standing there, looking at the petals slowly opening under the light. Their fragrance was soft, almost pleasant. The only problem was that in my mind, each of those flowers carried a different meaning. Grant thought those gentle gestures would make me trust him one more time. He didn't know that every flower he brought home only made the smell of lies in our apartment heavier. The rehearsal dinner was held at a large hotel in Midtown Manhattan, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked straight down at the stream of headlights moving like long trails of light below. My family had rented a private dining room on the top floor, large enough for both sides of the family while still feeling intimate. Round tables covered in white linens had already been set. Low candles burned steadily on each one, and at the front of the room stood a small podium where people would get up to give speeches congratulating Olivia and Daniel. I arrived about 20 minutes before Grant. Claire was already there, speaking with the wedding coordinator to check the seating chart one last time. Olivia was standing near the window with Daniel, the two of them looking down at the city as if trying to breathe before the wedding day. When she saw me walk in, Olivia turned around immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I'm okay." That was the simplest answer I could give. The truth was, I was calm in a strangely unsettling way. Not the kind of calm that comes when everything is fine, but the kind of calm that comes when you know something is about to happen and there is nothing left that can change it. I went into the small dressing room beside the hallway to adjust my dress. The emerald green dress fit perfectly, falling to my ankles. I had bought it 3 days earlier in a small shop on Madison Avenue. The earrings I was wearing were a gift from my mother on my wedding day, tiny stones sparkling under the warm yellow light. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I no longer saw the woman who had been sitting in front of a laptop at 2 a.m. a few days earlier. The woman in the mirror looked very calm, almost distant. When I stepped out of the dressing room, Grant had just arrived. He stopped in the hallway when he saw me. For the first few seconds, he said nothing, only looked at me as if he had just discovered something new. Then he smiled, stepped closer, and lightly placed his hand on my back, the same familiar gesture he always used in front of family. "You look amazing," he said. His voice sounded so sincere that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed him. In his eyes, there was a flash of genuine admiration, but there was something else too. The confidence of a man who believed tonight would unfold exactly according to his plan. "Thank you," I said. Grant looked around the room, checking every table as if he were the one hosting this dinner. He asked the wedding coordinator a few questions about the seating chart, then turned to me. "Naomi's on the way," he said lightly. "She's stuck in traffic." I only nodded. We walked into the dining room together. A few relatives had already arrived and were starting to talk. The sound of glasses clinking and soft laughter created an atmosphere that was almost festive. Claire stood near the champagne table, talking with my Aunt Margaret. When she saw me, she gave me one very small nod. Just one gesture, enough to say that everything was still going according to plan. I picked up a glass of champagne, but didn't drink it. Instead, I stood near the large window, where I could see almost the entire room. From there, I could watch everyone without drawing attention. The phone in my hand vibrated softly. A message from Ethan. "They just got out of the car. He's touching her lower back." I read that line once, then locked my phone screen. In that moment, I could almost see the scene outside the hotel. Grant stepping out of the car, Naomi beside him, his hand resting on her back as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. I slipped my phone into my purse. My mother came to stand beside me right after that. She looked around the room for a moment, then toward Grant, who was talking to my father near the bar. "Grant seems a little tense," she said quietly. "Do you know what's going on?" I looked at Grant. He was smiling, but the smile looked a little stiff. He checked his phone twice in 1 minute. "No," I said. "Probably just wedding pressure." My mother kept watching him for a few more seconds. "I hope so," she said, then adjusted the tablecloth in front of her. A few minutes later, Olivia came over to me. She looked at my dress and smiled. "You look like you just stepped out of a movie," she said. "Hopefully not a tragedy," I replied. Olivia laughed, but the smile quickly disappeared when she looked toward the doorway. Something changed in her eyes. I turned in the direction she was looking. Grant was standing near the door, his back straight, as if he had just seen someone he had been waiting for. And then the door opened. Naomi walked in without the slightest hesitation. Grant immediately stepped forward, placed his hand on her lower back, and guided her into the center of the room. She was wearing an ivory dress, almost the same shade as Olivia's wedding gown. Not completely white, but close enough that any woman in the room would notice. I felt Olivia stiffen beside me. Daniel, standing just behind her, looked Naomi up and down, then turned to Grant. His expression turned noticeably colder. Grant seemed not to notice, or pretended not to. He led Naomi straight into the middle of the room, speaking to a few relatives near the door as if she naturally belonged there. My mother came closer to me again, her voice lower than before. "That's Naomi?" "Yes," I said. She looked at Naomi's dress one more time. A flash of irritation crossed her face very quickly. "Tonight," I said softly, almost to myself, "everybody gets clarity." My mother turned to look at me, but before she could ask another question, Grant was already leading Naomi straight toward us. Grant brought Naomi directly toward me, as if it were the most natural thing in this room. His hand still rested lightly on her back, that familiar gesture I had seen him use with me hundreds of times in front of friends and family. When they stopped in front of me, Grant smiled, his voice full of the confidence of a man who thought he was in complete control of the situation. "Bella," he said, "you remember Naomi." Naomi looked at me and gave me a very beautiful smile. It was the kind of smile worn by a woman who believed she had just stepped perfectly into her role. Her eyes moved briefly over my dress, then stopped at the earrings my mother had given me on my wedding day, as if measuring something. "It's so nice to see you," she said. I looked into her eyes for a few seconds. The distance between us was only a few steps, but I felt as if I were looking at a photograph that had been edited too carefully. Everything was correct, but nothing was real. I reached out my hand to shake hers. "I know exactly who she is," I said. Grant paused very slightly, but only for a moment. Maybe he thought it was just a polite remark. Or maybe he thought I was trying to look gracious in front of everyone. Either way, he did not have time to think about it any longer, because at that exact moment the dining room door opened. The sound of the metal hinge was soft, but clear enough to make a few people near the door turn around. A man walked in, tall, wearing a dark gray suit, his phone still in his hand, as if he had just ended a call. He stood still for 1 second in the doorway, his eyes sweeping across the room before stopping on us. Ethan Pierce. For the first few seconds, almost no one said anything, not because they knew who he was, but because there was something in the way he stood there that made the entire room go silent. The silence spread from the doorway into the middle of the tables, like someone had turned off the music in the middle of a party. Naomi was the first to react. The champagne glass in her hand slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor. The sound of shattering glass rang sharply against the stone floor, and drops of champagne splashed across her dress. Grant jerked to his feet. "Ethan?" he said, his voice higher than usual. Ethan walked into the room with the same slow, steady stride he had used when he entered the cafe the day before. He stopped a few steps from our table, looked at Naomi, then at Grant. His face was completely calm. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic." He looked around the room once, then added in a voice that was almost gentle, "Also, apparently I was invited months ago. I just didn't know it." A few people in the room started looking at each other. Olivia stood a few steps away from me, her hand gripping Daniel's arm tightly. My mother said nothing, but I could feel her standing very straight behind me. Grant tried to smile, but the smile did not last long. "Ethan, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "There has," Ethan said, cutting him off. "There have been a lot of misunderstandings." He placed a manila envelope on the nearest table. He did not throw it down, only set it there. But the sound of paper touching the tabletop was still clear enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "I brought a few things to clear that up," he said. Grant looked at the envelope, then looked at me. For the first time that evening, I saw the confidence in his eyes begin to shake. I stepped forward, standing beside Ethan. "Maybe we should start with Boston," I said. Ethan opened the envelope and pulled out the first sheet, a printed Marriott Copley Place hotel bill. He placed it on the table so the people closest could see it. "Grant told his wife he was in Boston to meet investors," Ethan said. "Naomi told me she was there for a marketing conference. The interesting part is that they were both staying at the same hotel, on the same floor." Grant opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but Ethan had already placed the second paper on the table. It was a receipt from a restaurant in Midtown. "Tuesday dinner," Ethan continued. "Grant said he was meeting clients. Naomi said she was having dinner with friends. Turns out they were sitting at the same table." I took out my phone and opened a photo. "And this," I said, turning the screen so my parents could see it. Hotel lobby camera in Tribeca. Grant and Naomi leaving the elevator at 11:42 p.m. A few whispers began spreading through the room. Ethan kept pulling out more papers. A St. Regis bill, private dining reservations at the restaurant in Tribeca, and a printout from Naomi's phone where Grant's number was saved under the name Pilates instructor. Grant shook his head, his voice starting to tighten. "This is ridiculous. It's all just coincidence." "Really?" I asked. Ethan placed a small jewelry box on the table. Inside was a thin diamond necklace. 3 weeks ago," he said. $2,800. Grant bought it. Naomi is wearing it." Naomi instinctively lifted her hand to her neck, as if only then remembering the necklace she was wearing. Grant turned to me, his voice lower now. "Bella, listen to me." "No," I said. The room fell silent again. Grant tried to regain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding." Ethan looked at him for a few seconds, then slowly pulled one final paper from the envelope. Not a receipt, not a photo, a printed color email. "I think this is the interesting part," Ethan said. He placed the paper in front of Grant, but read it aloud for the entire room to hear. "Naomi wrote to Grant that she would keep Ethan soft at next week's party so Grant could get information about the investment contract." The whole room seemed to freeze. Ethan looked at Grant, his voice still calm in a way that was terrifying. "So, this is not just an old flame showing up again." I looked at Grant, then at Naomi. The two of them stood only a few steps apart, but for the first time that night, they were not looking at each other. "This is ambition," I said. "Opportunity, money, and a game the two of you thought no one would be smart enough to see." Grant opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue again, but I spoke before he could. You didn't betray me because you loved her, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. You betrayed me because you thought both of us were stupid enough to believe you. The moment I said those words, the room fell into a thick, heavy silence. No one moved. No one said anything. Grant stood in front of me like someone had just pulled all the air from his lungs. Naomi was different. She looked around the room, panic rising in her eyes as she realized there was not a single face standing with her. The champagne stains spreading across her dress made her look even more out of place in a room full of people staring at her. My father, Walter, was the first to speak. He rose slowly, set his wine glass down on the table, then looked directly at Grant. His voice was not loud, but the firmness in it made the whole room hear every word. He said there was nothing more to discuss tonight, and he asked the hotel staff to escort Grant and Naomi out immediately. There was no fury, no shouting, just the cold judgment of a man who understood exactly where the boundary of his family stood. Naomi seemed about to say something, but before she could open her mouth, my mother stood up. Margaret had always been the one most concerned with appearances in our family. For years, she had been the one who always smiled, always softened every awkward moment in front of guests. But tonight she did not smile. She simply looked at Naomi calmly and said one very clear sentence. Not in my daughter's family, and not at my daughter's table. The sentence was so brief that no one could possibly misunderstand what it meant. On the other side of the table, Olivia suddenly began to cry. Not loudly, just tears falling as she covered her mouth with her hand. Daniel stood up immediately and wrapped an arm around his fiancé's shoulders. Olivia shook her head, trying to hold it together, but still managed to say through her tears that she was not crying because of this scandal. She was crying because only tonight had she finally understood what her sister had been living through all this time. When I heard that, I felt my heart drop for a beat, but the tears still did not come. I just stood there, calmer than I had ever imagined I could be. Daniel then did something simple that made the entire room understand it was over. He walked to the chair Naomi had been sitting in, pulled it away from the family table, and set it aside. He said nothing, looked at no one. Just one small, unmistakable act. That chair did not belong at this table. In the corner of the room, Claire was still standing near the champagne table. I saw that her phone camera was open. When our eyes met, she gave the slightest tilt of her head, not to post anything online or make a scene. She only wanted to keep a record in case Grant later tried to tell the story a different way. 2 hotel security staff appeared at the door right then. One of them stepped toward Grant and said very politely that they would escort him out. Naomi turned first, almost too quickly, but Grant did not. He stood still for one more second, then slowly turned back. He did not look at Naomi. He looked at me. In his eyes, there was no longer any of the confidence or challenge he had carried at that Sunday dinner in Connecticut. For the first time, I saw that he understood everything was over. Not just a secret exposed, but the entire shell he had built around himself for months. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I picked up the champagne glass from the table, took a small sip, then set it back down. My voice was so calm that even I was surprised to hear it in the silent room. I simply said that my attorney would contact him on Monday. No anger, no shaking, just a statement. Grant looked at me for one more second, then turned away. Naomi was already standing near the door, clutching her purse tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The 2 of them walked out into the hallway with the security staff. The door closed behind them with a very soft sound, but it felt as if the whole room had exhaled at once. A few seconds passed in silence. Then my grandfather, who had been sitting quietly since the beginning of the evening, slowly lifted his whiskey glass. He looked around the table, his expression both tired and amused in the way of a man who had lived too long to still be shocked by things like this. He said that at least now we knew exactly who did not belong in this family. A few small laughs broke out, hesitant at first, but then spread across the table. Walter let out a long breath, as if he had just set down a heavy burden. He turned to the wedding coordinator and asked whether we could continue the evening. My mother straightened the tablecloth and said that tomorrow was still her daughter's wedding day, and we would not let anyone ruin that. The servers began bringing out the food. Wine glasses were refilled. Small conversations gradually returned. But the atmosphere in the room was completely different from an hour earlier. Less false. Fewer polite smiles. In their place were warm looks, light touches of the hand, genuine words of concern. Daniel pulled out a chair for Olivia to sit down. Claire set her phone on the table and let out a breath. Ethan stood beside me for a few seconds, then gently raised his glass toward me like a toast that did not need words. I looked around the room, where my family was still here, still sitting together, and for the first time in months I realized something very simple. I was not the one who fell apart that night. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath the clear sky of early fall, the kind of morning that makes you feel as if everything could begin again. The hotel was still bustling, as if nothing had happened the night before. Flower arrangements were being delivered into the lobby. Staff were adjusting every ribbon on the chairs, and guests were beginning to gather outside in the garden where the ceremony would take place. Olivia appeared in a wedding dress that was simple but elegant, her hair loosely pinned at the nape of her neck. When she saw me standing by the aisle, she came over and hugged me tightly. She did not say much, only whispered that today would be a beautiful day, and that she wanted me beside her when everything began. I nodded. Last night had felt like a storm moving through our family, but this morning was peaceful in a way that felt almost strange. I stood at the front of the garden when the ceremony began. When it came time for the reading, I stepped up to the podium with a small sheet of paper in my hand. I had thought I would be shaking, but when I looked down at Olivia and Daniel holding hands, my voice felt steadier than I ever imagined it could. I read a poem about honesty and trust, about how love is not proven by grand promises, but by the small things repeated every day. When I spoke the final line, I saw Olivia smiling through tears, and Daniel squeezed her hand more tightly. For the first time in weeks, I felt my heart grow lighter. During the reception, my phone kept vibrating in my purse. When I finally looked at it, the screen was full of messages from Grant. At first, they were long explanations, saying everything had been misunderstood, that he had only been trying to help Naomi through a difficult time. Then came requests to meet and talk in person, followed by blame placed on work pressure and the stress of the past few months. Finally, the messages became shorter, almost desperate, saying that he never meant to hurt me. I read them once, took screenshots of all of them, and sent them to my attorney. Then I turned off notifications. That was the last time I thought about him that day. News of the rehearsal dinner spread quickly through our social circle. The following week, Ethan told me he had officially separated from Naomi. There was no explosive fight, just a brief conversation in the living room where he placed his wedding ring on the table and said that everything had ended a long time ago. As for Grant, he began to realize the real consequences of his choices. The investment deal he had pursued for 8 months disappeared within a matter of days. Ethan did not need to say much. Simply pulling out of the project was enough for everyone else to understand what had happened. Grant's company also did not like seeing their name appear in whispers about scandal. A few weeks later, he was asked to leave his position for reasons of internal restructuring. Naomi did not fare much better. The email she had sent to Grant eventually came out during the legal process, and 2 major clients of the marketing firm where she worked immediately ended their contracts. But their downfall was not what brought this story to its end. In truth, after the first few weeks, I almost stopped thinking about them at all. I moved out of the old apartment and found a smaller place on the west side of the city. It did not have the same sweeping view as before, but the morning sunlight coming into the living room was beautiful. I began going to therapy every week, at first only to understand why I had ignored so many obvious signs. But little by little, those conversations helped me realize something more important. My instincts had never been wrong. I had simply learned to doubt myself in order to keep everything peaceful. I did not rush into a new relationship. For many months, my life revolved around very simple things: work, a few dinner evenings with Claire, long phone calls with Olivia after she returned from her honeymoon. I learned how to live alone again without feeling empty. Each day was so ordinary that sometimes I had to stop and realize just how precious that ordinariness was. About 8 months later, my attorney scheduled a meeting to finalize a few remaining papers related to the divorce. The person who needed to sign some of the documents with me was Ethan, because part of his evidence had been used in the case file. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Lower Manhattan. When I walked in, Ethan was already sitting at a table by the window with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. We greeted each other like old friends. After we finished signing the papers, we stayed seated for a while longer. No one mentioned Grant or Naomi anymore. Instead, we talked about very ordinary things: his new job, the small apartment I had just finished decorating, a new Italian restaurant that had opened near the park. At one point, Ethan laughed. He said that this was the first time we had met in a cafe without either of us carrying an envelope full of evidence. I laughed too. It was the kind of laughter that came with relief, without any of the bitterness of the previous months. When we left the cafe, we stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds. There were no grand promises, no sudden romantic story, just 2 people who had lived through the same storm, now standing in the ordinary sunlight of an afternoon. That evening, when I came home, I sat alone by the window. The city outside was still glowing with lights like every other night, but this time I no longer felt as though I were looking at a life that did not belong to me. I used to think the most painful betrayal was when the person you love sleeps with someone else, but it isn't. The most painful betrayal is when they look straight into your eyes and believe you will swallow the lie whole. That night, in the candlelit rehearsal dinner room, I did not save my marriage. I saved myself. Sometimes when I look back on that story, I realize that the most valuable thing was not who won or who lost, but the moment when someone finally learned how to stand on their own side. The story you just heard is a fictional story, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, with the hope of offering a small moment of reflection about trust, respect, and self-worth. It does not encourage anyone to follow the actions in the story. If this story touched you, please press like, follow the channel, and share your thoughts. And I would also really love to know, where are you watching from? And have you ever experienced a moment that forced you to choose to stand on your own side?